Okay, great. I think people are trickling in a bit more slowly now, so we'll get started. Thanks everyone for joining us, and welcome to this CSER panel on who is creating existential risk, why, and why should we care. Just to let everyone know that this session is being recorded so that we can post it on our YouTube channel afterwards, but no attendees are going to be visible during or heard during the session. Just briefly, this is a panel run by the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, CSER for short. Those of you who don't know, CSER is an interdisciplinary research centre based at the University of Cambridge, focused on studying and mitigating risks that could lead to either human extinction or civilizational collapse. So lots of happy things there. I'm Jess Whittlestone. I'm a senior research associate at CSER, where I co-lead our work on AI risks. And I'm going to be chairing this discussion today with my colleagues Luke and Tom, who I will ask to introduce themselves in a minute. Unfortunately, our third panelist, Lolita, couldn't make it today due to illness. So it's just the three of us. I think we're going to have to maybe stop every 10 minutes or so and just sort of ask ourselves, like, what would Lolita say here? So Tom and Luke, maybe I'll put that to you sometimes. Do you want to each briefly introduce yourselves? Maybe Tom first.
Of course, yeah. Thanks, Jess. Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Hobson. I'm a research associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. I also do some work with the BioRisk initiative at St. Catherine's here as well. My background prior to CSER is in international relations and science and technology studies with my PhD over at the University of Bath. My work at CSER is broadly concerned with how we think about the politics of technology and the future and how that relates to the very big risks and extreme risks that we study at CSER in a more kind of pragmatic or applied fashion. My work's about biosecurity and emerging technologies. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Luke?
Thanks, Jess. Hello, everyone. I am Luke Kemp. I am a research associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk as well. My technical title is to focus on foresight. In practice, I focus essentially on climate change as well as looking at societal collapses. My background is in a combination of economics, international relations, as well as human geography. And right now, my focus is largely looking at societal collapse and thinking about what that potentially means for our future and how the forces and political economy that causes or has caused past collapses potentially contributes to future ones as well.
Thanks, Luke. So just practically speaking, before we get started, we're going to have a bit of a discussion about the topic of the panel, and I'll make sure we've got sort of 10 minutes or so at the end for Q&A. But if you have questions while we're talking, please just put them in the Q&A, and I may, if they fit in with the discussion we're having, I might ask some throughout. So do ask questions throughout as they come to you. So with all of that, I think we'll get started. So I was going to ask both of you to get started. You know, this panel is about who is creating existential risk, and this, in my experience at least, isn't a question that has been asked a lot in the field so far. And so I wondered if you could both say a bit about why you think it hasn't been asked, and why might it be important to think about this question of who is creating existential risk, but sort of how do we do this in a way that isn't just a blame game, but is actually sort of productive and constructive? Luke, maybe do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think blame games can be incredibly constructive. I think understanding who's responsible, if you're looking at leverage points for change, is absolutely critical. If we just try to deal on the abstracts and think about what are the different hazards that are occurring, we're not really understanding how the hazards or vulnerabilities that compose a risk occur. And by understanding the kind of networks of power that shape and create these risks, you can actually think about not just stopping certain hazards, but actually stopping existential risk overall occurring. And to me, this is a very different way of thinking about existential risk. Right now, when we tend to talk about existential risk, you basically have a top 10 list of different hazards that are kind of randomly chosen, more or less. To me, when you think about risk, you have to think about an overall level of risk that is produced by a particular type of socioeconomic system. And that system, of course, is composed by certain actors who have certain kinds of incentives. And once you start to pick that out, you can think of much better leverage points for actually preventing existential risk in the long term. If you were an existential risk scholar back in the 1940s, you only really had one to deal with, which was nukes. And if you, of course, targeted nukes, you would potentially stop that hazard. But if you thought about the deeper forces causing it, such as arms races, you don't just prevent nukes, you also prevent bioweapons and a slew of other different things being imposed. So I think if you want to be a real long-termist, you actually have to look at who's responsible and think about the sources of existential risks, rather than just focus upon the abstract category of hazards.
Yeah, and I think we can get into this, but that also maybe takes you away from who being this very specific. It's not necessarily specific individuals. I mean, in some cases you might think about specific individuals, but also it is like, what are the broader systems and structures that underpin risk, and how do we think about that? Tom, what do you think? What would you add to that?
I think there'll be a degree of repetition. I think the really obvious starting point is the basic practical first step, which is, if our work is, or broadly and hopefully our shared aim as just people existing, is to not go extinct or have things become incredibly horrible, one kind of really basic first step in trying to do that effectively would be thinking where these hazards come from. And I think probably a large part of that is thinking which, either in some instances, as you've alluded, Jess, you could wag a finger at an individual, but perhaps more usefully, which kind of social groups or which kind of structures within society uphold that. I think moving on from that, one thing which maybe brings us to, it's not necessarily an answer to your why haven't we talked a lot about it question, but it's maybe a response to why we should in a more developed fashion. And that would be, my contention is that we're operating with an anthropology of who creates X risk and who is, or what type of people are a hazard anyway. I think often that's just quite unspoken. Now, that's not, again, to apply anything malicious on the researchers in the field that haven't spoken about it, just we haven't done. So, to my mind, the easiest example there is we're all quite comfortable with the example of like a rogue actor or you know, some non-state actor getting hold of a bioweapon or a pathogen. Now, obviously, we're not comfortable with the consequences of that, but we quite like that as an example. I think we have to be robust with ourselves if we're going to talk about having an evidenced approach to existential risk and think, do we really have much to rely on that says that is a bigger concern than other actors that we could say we have either a kind of robust way of thinking about or even a historically evidenced way that have a much bigger access to the things that could create hazards?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that springs to mind for me is that, you know, maybe part of the explanation of the why we haven't asked this question so much in the past is, well, you know, this field of existential risk is still relatively small, started off very small. If you don't have that many resources, maybe you do want to sort of focus on the far end of the mitigation. They're like, okay, let's identify where the sort of threats from biotechnology or where the threats from nukes might come and stop that from happening. And just because that has a bit more urgency to it, even though it's nonetheless like very important to think back and think about like what are the underlying structures and things and systems that are causing this. What do you think of that? Would you agree? Would you disagree? Either of you?
I think I wouldn't go, no, it's not that. I think it would be one of those hopefully constructive yes and answers. So I wouldn't say that that's a better way. I'd say it's the way we've done. And there's a lot of use in that. This is not to throw that in the bin. That has yielded like a lot of really useful contribution from this field and related fields. I would say, I mean, I'm sure some people would disagree. To me, saying that that is the best way or that was like strategically the right, I think naturalizes kind of what we've done as the field and implies it was correct. And I think this brings us to tie that back to why it's important to think about who creates existential risk. I think that is, again, thinking about, why the field hasn't talked about it. It's because our concepts of what is important and what we should pay attention to here are exactly as subjective and epistemologically grounded as any other field. So this field, and I believe Luke can speak with a bit more authority on this than I can because he's read more of this particular kind of field. But our field comes from its own intellectual origins, one of which is the kind of effective altruism-based long-termism, which will have identified concepts such as paying attention to a lone gunman or road actor as something that arguably they can make more difference to. I think that kind of tangibility thing might be one of the reasons we do that. I don't think it necessarily means that that was the thing we had to do. And I think thinking about where risks come from and who, to stick with the subject of this panel, is one thing that might help us evolve doing other as well as just that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to be clear, I was definitely not suggesting that the sort of just focus on the endpoint and stopping the risks from getting really bad is the best thing to do. But it was like, you can imagine in sort of urgency, resource constraints settings, that might be the thing that you kind of jump to first. Luke, did you want to add anything to what Tom said?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And I think there's definitely something to this idea that if you're feeling that you're resource constrained, and of course it's an open situation, you want to focus upon the endpoint and you want to be targeted in terms of your intervention. I do think that even if you're not looking at the kind of most fundamental long-termist intervention, and even if you are resource constrained trying to act with urgency, there's still often good reasons to try to understand the problem from a responsibility point of view and target activism. We see this when it comes to climate change, for instance. If you're resource constrained, you want to make sure that you're actually hitting the correct leverage point. And if you don't understand who's responsible, it's actually kind of difficult to do that. And if you are trying to act with urgency, sometimes it's much easier to target particular networks of power rather than trying to target a particular hazard, for instance. So yeah. I don't think that fully captures it. And my slightly more provocative take is that if existential risk is primarily created by the powerful, then of course they're not going to want it to be studied. There's going to be less funding for it. There's going to be more cultural pressure not to study it. And just by nature, it's going to be much easier to study these kind of more abstract concepts like the dual use implications of certain technologies, rather than asking who shapes how we use certain technologies, who's going to benefit from them, who bears the risks that they pose, etc. These are much more politically charged questions and are much less likely to get funding, particularly from kind of philanthropic or private sources. And there are also ones which just by nature are going to push at very powerful people and very powerful constellations of actors. And that's just not going to be anyone near as much leverage or support.
Luke, just on a practical note, we're getting a couple of comments that your audio isn't great. Do you think you can maybe just try sort of speaking close to the microphone or something? I think, definitely agree with all of that and the need to look at the stuff. Also, one thing that occurred to me is it's sort of easy to frame this asking about the sources of risk as sort of going further along the chain and going back and looking at these harder to influence things. But actually, if you look at something like pandemics, if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, which isn't the threshold of an existential risk, but is certainly something that could get close to it. Actually, a lot of the ways, a lot of the things that we're hearing people talk about now is how sort of institutional failures led to failing to mitigate the risk and sort of once it had arisen. So it's not just sort of who is creating risk, but also who and what is making it difficult for us to address risk when they arise. And there's lots of discussion of sort of the failures of international coordination and the failures of governments to implement the right policies and things. So I think, this feels like a question that needs to be asked across sort of like all levels and stages of thinking about risk. Someone just asked in the Q&A, which is a good question, what kinds of existential risks are you referring to? And I guess we should be a bit clearer about that. I wonder whether it might be useful for us to sort of talk through a few different types of risks that each of us work on and some of the ways that we might think about these questions as applying to. So maybe Tom, you could talk about risks from biotechnology, and Luke, maybe climate or environmental related risks, and then maybe I can say a bit about AI. I don't know who, Tom, do you want to jump in first and see if Luke fixes his audio?
Yeah, of course. I was trying to gesture politely to let Luke go first, but there we go. Yeah, of course. So my work is I think quite holistic. I'm concerned with what we do with technology and what technology does with us broadly. But the only area I could claim to really be any empirical expert on would be biotechnology and the governance of life sciences more broadly. When we talk about the very big risks or existential risks that could emerge from that field, I think, well, it's worth prefacing this with it can often be it's a difficult conversation to even begin having sometimes, because there are many people who are practicing scientists in the field who are quite accustomed to quite a kind of headline grabbing scientists wanting to invent sheep with lasers on them to wipe humans out kind of headline, which is not really the kind of thing we're concerned about at all. So within the bio field of existential risks, we have things such as pandemics and pathogens, which we've just in various different ways lived through over the last 18 months. In fact, longer than that now, 20 months. And we also have a set of things which we can say are man-made or man-enhanced from in that similar category. So that would be someone getting hold of or someone accidentally or maliciously making a pathogen or natural entity more scary. There's also stuff which is a little bit harder to trace, which would be things we are doing with life sciences research or with intersecting research, which might have biological elements that are not supposed to be scary, not supposed to have any bad effects whatsoever, but might do, because that's the nature of scientific advance or the nature of what we are doing in any kind of research anyway. The broad way people have always talked about this has been dual use, which separates things into this is its good purpose or ostensibly good purpose. This is the unattended, possibly bad consequence. And in this camp's also what these scary people, these rogue actors might do. One of our research affiliates, who I don't know who's sat in the audience tonight, Sam Weiss-Evans, is one of the people who works in the sphere of research on synthetic biology, who's been really proactive in pushing a kind of, I think, richer and more holistic conception of this dual use dilemma, which is it's not thinking this is the good thing, plus there could be something bad. It's thinking what are the benefits and harms implicit in this research that we're carrying out anyway. And that includes taking a step backwards and bringing us towards our theme of the panel, which is that takes it away from just being a scientist in a lab, either making an error or being an intrinsically good or bad person, to locating someone within a whole broader structure of funding priorities, social and political priorities, lab practice culture. And I think maybe usefully, I'm speaking slightly towards what Lalita would have wanted to talk about issues here as well, although not doing it justice. And I guess bringing us to that question again of like, is it useful to try and blame a person? I think probably the shorthand is there are maybe a handful of occasions where we could, but the rest of it is it's about thinking more seriously about who and where hazards are created from and how that might align to the structures and organization of our society, both locally and globally.
So I've chucked in a pair of headphones. People in the Q&A / chat, let me know if this is clearer. Hopefully it is, because otherwise I have no options.
I think it's a bit better.
Thank you, Michael. So when it comes to climate change, this is my kind of primary focus, or was primary focus. I spent around about a decade involved in international climate negotiations, and this is something that has really shaped my perspective when it comes to thinking about the political economy and responsibility of different existential risks. Now, when we say existential risk, the problem is that I don't think we have any good definitions as it stands as to what constitutes an existential risk. One problem is that we typically always confuse risk with hazard. And you actually look at things like the disaster risk management literature, risk is much more complicated. It's not just simply a hazard, it's composed of the hazard, a vulnerability, and the exposure to that combination. And additionally, when we think about existential risk, we tend to always think about single siloed hazards rather than thinking about an overall level of risk. And I think it's important to do the latter because when you look at the closest parallels we have to these big kind of catastrophic occurrences, so things like societal collapses or mass extinction events, it's very rare that it is caused by a single hazard. It's almost always a series of vulnerabilities, interacting hazards, and knock-on effects that cause something really, really bad to occur. Generally speaking, when I'm talking about existential risk, I'm talking about either a vulnerability or a hazard, sometimes an exposure, that creates a significant contribution to the likelihood of humans going extinct in the coming centuries. And that's still very much a working definition, but I think it's better than what you typically use in the field. From the perspective of climate change, there's always been this big debate about who is responsible. Is it the kind of masses of citizens who demand energy, or is it a small collection of fossil fuel companies and particular countries, what people often refer to as the fossil combustion complex, the fossil fuel industry? To me, it becomes increasingly clear over time that it is really the latter rather than the former. That when you look at the way either emissions from the supply chain, from production, or from consumption are structured, it's highly concentrated. So historically, the top 10 emitters are responsible for roughly 81% of historical emissions. When you look at it from an industry perspective, roughly 100 companies are responsible for, let me check that stat, 71% of industrial emissions. So note that's industrial, not overall emissions. And similarly, when you actually look at, as Jess mentioned, the important factor of who's shaping the policy and often distorting policy, it is crystal clear who's doing it. And it's not masses of citizens, it's things like emergence of doubt. We have very good evidence that most large fossil fuel companies understood the reality of climate change dating back to the 80s and even earlier. And not only do they ignore it, but they actively try to suffocate policy, spread disinformation, and essentially destroy anything that was going to threaten their underlying bottom line, which is, of course, their profit. So it's pretty difficult to hold citizens accountable for this. And I think particularly because citizens don't actually want fossil fuels, they want energy. And they don't necessarily want all of the problems that come alongside fossil fuels. And when you actually look at the polling data on this, as well as all the experience we have in deliberative democracies, it's pretty clear that when you actually give people both the power and the options, they don't go towards fossil fuels and they don't go towards things that will destroy the climate. So to me, it's really a clear case. And I think that the lessons we can take in terms of responsibility and understanding it for climate change are actually surprisingly applicable to a range of other bad hazards and vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Luke, because I was sort of thinking, as some of the things you were speaking about, I was thinking I'd like to get on to talking a bit more about, like what do we do about this? Once we have a better understanding of who are the creators, what do we do? And I do think that climate change is an area where nowhere near enough has been done, but progress has been made in sort of curtailing the impact and the power of fossil fuel companies, and there are things that we can sort of learn from that. I thought I might briefly speak to sort of how I think about some of these things within the domain of AI risk. And I do think also there are some parallels. So one sort of idea that's emerged within the sort of field of thinking about AI risk in the last couple of years is, well, actually sort of stepping back a minute, I think when people first started talking about risks from AI, they were fairly sort of focused on either sort of accident type risks. So, you develop AI systems, you give them a lot of control over society, and then they fail in really important ways that has catastrophic consequences. Really real important source of risk, especially as we start thinking about using AI in more critical infrastructure and things like that. And then the other sort of kind of risk that was talked about was misuse risk. So this is sort of the lone rogue actor or malicious actors taking powerful AI systems and using them in some way that is deliberately supposed to cause harm. So whether that's sort of targeted drone attacks or using them to engineer other kinds of like dangerous technologies. But actually in the sort of the conversation around AI risk in recent years, spurred on by a paper by Alan Defoe and Remco Zwetsloot, there's been this sort of emergence of thinking more about what's called structural risk. And obviously the misuse is a who, right? Like there are actors, there are bad actors who do things. But I think some of what we're trying to point out in this panel and Tom and Luke are trying to point out is more sort of like the structures of society, the way our society is constructed, who has power, what incentives they have. Like these are things that shape risk. And I think this is a perspective that is really important within AI and is gaining more traction. So this idea that, and in a way, actually, the way this is talked about in the context of AI is interesting because a lot of the time the framing is like, there is no actor who is deliberately trying to cause harm, but they just have incentives that cause them to do things that end up being harmful, right? So like tech companies might not be deliberately trying to build algorithmic systems that are biased against people, but they do have incentives to build systems that meet whatever objectives they have, whether that's like getting more clicks or getting more revenue. And there's a kind of maybe not much incentive or accountability to identify the harms. Now it's a bit sort of, there's then a thing you can debate about, right? Well, how blameworthy are they? Probably still quite. But like there is something here that's like risk can emerge from the structures of society and the kinds of incentives and power distributions that exist, even if like no individual or group is really trying to do harm. They're just acting in self-interest. And I think that's something we're seeing come up more in the debate around AI. And I think a lot more talk about how do we hold big tech companies accountable and incentivize them to think about and mitigate the harms that they might be causing is getting really, really important. And I think maybe, not to say there's a perfect analogy between AI companies and fossil fuel companies, but like there is some stuff that maybe could be learned there around how do we hold these actors accountable. I don't know if either of you want to add anything else on this topic.
I did just quickly want to say, I hope as soon as we haven't given the impression that through either Luke or my comments or your summary, that the structuring of society and this ordering is therefore like ineffable and static, and therefore there's a complete washing of, there's no agency at any point and no responsibility to be given at any point. I think what we would rather like to suggest, I think, is the complexity. And whilst people do bear responsibility for their role within these structures repeatedly, I think it's often worth seeing this as part of a both within state and international, like power hierarchy or system of global organizations, rather than, well, this is just how it is, I guess we'll have to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point I want to add too. In our field in particular, I think we tend to fall into this trap of thinking that the way society is currently structured and the trends we see are not just inevitable, but so unnatural. And it's not usually spelled out, but to me, it seems to echo in international relations the theories of neorealism and realism, which is essentially this idea that states are self-interested, kind of profit maximizing, as kind of a typical rational agent, and that makes war largely not quite inevitable, but at least it's a security dilemma. And neorealism basically posits this is because of the way the international system is. That's anarchical, have an overall arbiter. Well, classical realism says it's largely due to human nature. That humans are basically, as Thomas Hobbes described them, nasty and brutish and short-lived. There's not a lot of evidence whatsoever for the latter, that humans actually are terrible individuals. As a matter of fact, when you actually look at the evidence from things like disaster risk literature as well as psychology, there's a pretty good case to be made that humans are actually pretty fundamentally decent. And I think actually there's a good case to be made here that when you just think about all the access most of us have to doing large amounts of damage, the fact that the world is in the worst place is actually kind of in a way credence to how good we are. Well, most of us have access to a weapon of mass destruction on a small scale in a car, and yet the actual use of cars as kind of a terrorist instrument is incredibly low in most countries. And when it does happen, it obviously makes headlines. And in terms of the latter form of this idea that these structures as kind of emerge when you have anarchy, again, there's not really much evidence there. And it seems to be based upon some kind of weird magical thinking that once you have a state or once you have a large number of actors, they're automatically going to behave in a certain way. And again, it's just not a really good amount of evidence there. Instead, I think a good way of thinking about this is there's certain constellations of power and networks of power that tend to occur that are historically constructed. And of course, by understanding why they're constructed and by understanding who usually has the most agency and has the most benefit from them, you can start to deconstruct them and build them in new ways. But if you're stuck into thinking they're inevitable, then it restricts your options drastically. And I think that's one of the greatest curses I've heard, is this idea of technological determinism, that certain technologies is going to get built, get used to it, and the only way around that is simply to build less dangerous technologies first, to protect the ones first, and more dangerous ones later. That seems to be just a failure of lack of imagination. To me, we can construct the world in just a huge number of different ways. And when you look at anthropology of history, that's very clear. And by saying that we're locked into one very particular mode of being and mode of producing technology, all that does is provide cover for the agents to do.
Yeah, so I think this gets us into an interesting point, which is, how far can we go to change these sort of the underlying societal structures that we think are causing existential risk, and sort of how, which I'd love to dig into a bit more with you both. Maybe sort of related to that, someone in the chat also in the Q&A also asked a useful question of just like, what sort of answers would be possible to this who question? What kinds of entities and structures, which I feel like we're sort of darting around a little bit, but haven't explicitly answered. So maybe I wonder if each of you could tell me a bit about like, what are, in your mind, sort of like, what's your answer to that question at the moment? Like, what are the kinds of the structures in society and the entities that you're most concerned about creating existential risk? And like, what would you like to see changed? And sort of, maybe that's going a bit, we can come back to it, but kind of like, what are the structures a bit more specifically? And how optimistic are you about changing them? Because it is, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's hard, certainly. Whoever wants to go first.
So politely, thank you. So magnanimous, in fact. Thanks, Jess. Yeah, it's really, this is the point at which this question has to start being answered. And you're right, it starts becoming more difficult. First, because I think everyone gets more nervous when you're asked to start, giving a direct answer as to who or what is the problem. And the second part of it, the what to be done, that gets difficult because it's the really hard part. Both in terms of having the imagination to think what the response is, albeit there's lots of great historical examples and political works that suggest it. And secondly, because it can seem so difficult to actually find to use a really martial metaphor, like the chink in the armor of the system as is, in order to advocate for these alternatives. I think if I think of my own field of research tightly to start with, it seems quite straightforward to me that we spend too much time worrying about this lone wolf factor and rather less time acknowledging that the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, is still the largest, or certainly one of the largest funders of basic scientific and advanced scientific research in the world. Now, this is not to do the let's all be terrified, they're trying to engineer bioweapons to kill us all. It's just to acknowledge the simple fact that it is a military force. Now, it has a hugely distorting effect on the entire makeup of scientific research when one of the largest funders globally is the US Army. And again, at the risk of really over-egging this, I'm not calling anyone a bad guy who's doing work in a lab, but this is not to say if you take that money, you're a bad guy. There is a case to be made that you shouldn't take it, but that's up to you. The point here is simply, it has an effect, it means something, and that is something we should think about a lot. I think, to say that the US military is one of the scariest entities in the world, in terms of the scale of risk we're talking about, shouldn't feel controversial. But I'm sure, as you can tell from how much I'm qualifying this, it feels a controversial thing to say in our field. I also think taking a broader look out with just my field of research, it seems quite clear to me that most of the things which are frightening or which have the capacity to exert the biggest hazard on us are not things which are within the hand of another person walking down the street. They're within the hands of people with the capacity to make decisions about them. Those would be people with the launch keys for a nuclear missile, so very senior political figures or generals. They would be within the hands of people who run or at the upper echelons of very large organizations and businesses who, again, whether through malintent or their willing or unwilling embrace of the system we operate within, have a huge amount of potential to make a decision that shapes how resources are extracted, where they're extracted from, what costs they're put to market with, and basically who wins and loses in their accumulation of wealth. Now, I want to hold myself back from going on a huge kind of exploration of how we cannot view consumption as apart from production. So I think that's a really important question when we think about who's responsible. It shifts us away from thinking about where production is done, towards where production comes from and how wealth is accumulated there, and away from thinking, let's all have recyclable straws because that'll solve the climate crisis. I think Luke might do a better job on that aspect of political economy. But I think, I'll stop myself there with that direct accusation at the US military and at the world's billionaires, because I think that shouldn't be controversial.
Cool. I'll pick up on that direct accusation and hopefully be more provocative. So I think when you look at both the history of global catastrophic and existential risks, as well as just thinking at it from a logical point of view, it's quite clear that your average citizen can't cause it. That what is required to actually destroy large amounts of people, potentially the entire world and their entire species, it requires an enormous amount of power, and it usually requires secrecy as well. And when you look at the kind of beginning of existential risk, most people, including Tony Robbins, have pressed it. Precipice kind of located back from the Manhattan Project. And interestingly, the term Manhattan Project is now misused as a synonymous kind of term for a mass mobilization of resources towards creating a weapon of mass destruction under conditions of great secrecy. And I think for me, that is a fairly good understanding of how most existential risks occur. And of course, this then brings a question of what is power. And I like to use Michael Mann's source of social power framework, which thinks about this in terms of ideology, economic power, military power, and political power. And when you have enough of one source of power, it tends to spill into other fields. So Bill Gates doesn't just have economic power, but when he makes book recommendations, people listen to him. He has ideological power, by the way. And he also has, of course, political power through his use of financing as well as just through direct lobbying as well. And this goes for most billionaires as well. Now, when we look at different hazards, it's quite clear that their production is very much concentrated in the hands of few secretive, powerful few. So I already mentioned climate. When you look at nukes, it's pretty clear cut. 89% of the arsenal is held by 2 countries. Most of the new innovations and inventions that are happening in nuclear warfare, largely again sent from those 2 countries, the US and Russia. When we look at lethal autonomous weapons, it is largely down, at least according to one review by Henry Garcia, 5 countries, with the US being the outright leader. A separate report talked about how there's kind of 30 high-risk companies who are kind of underpinning the supply chain of lethal autonomous weapons. When you look at AGI, or artificial general intelligence, which is kind of difficult to define, and it's really difficult to say who's directly working with per se. The closest we have is one stated by Seth Bauman and colleagues, which basically pinpointed, what was it, 72 projects, 9 have military connections, and roughly half in the US and most in the US ally. When you look at all this from a perspective of countries, it's pretty clear which country is most responsible for existential risk. It's the US. They're the largest historical emitter, responsible for roughly a quarter of overall historical emissions. They, on top of that, are the leader when it comes to both lethal autonomous weapons and the kind of creation of new dangerous technologies. They're the outright leader when it comes to artificial intelligence projects, and they're also the 2nd largest in terms of the nuclear arsenal. And even when you look at this in terms of who's starting policy, again, it's hard to overlook the US. Kemp protocol was largely lampooned by the US. The adoption of the verification scheme under the bioweapons convention, again, the US. Even if you look at the arms race, it's a good case to be made that largely what inspired it was this perpetuation of a bomber and missile gap by the US military industrial complex. And if you want to break it down even further, I think there's really kind of 3 key networks that are behind most risks. And those are the military industrial complex, what you could call the extraction complex, so essentially the combination of fossil fuel industry and others. And if you're going to take a wider notion of existential risk and think of just really bad outcomes like surveillance states, then the Storber complex, a collection of big tech plus security and intelligence agencies who seem hell-bent upon creating surveillance states. So overall, I think there's a very good case to be made that there's just certain key nodes and networks of actors who are behind most hazards in the creation of those vulnerabilities. And they tend to be ones which held great amount of power and also large amounts of secrecy as well.
So I want to push you a bit more on the action question, because I feel like that was, maybe I just asked too many questions at once, or maybe you felt like that was too difficult to answer. I mean, I think there are 2 levels on which you might answer this question. I think it would be interesting just to think about, you're saying a bunch of these ways the world is, a bunch of these institutions and complexes are underpinning risk. What would it look like for the world to not be like that, and for there to be less risk? And in particular, how do we have, and in particular, sort of like, how do we have that and still, can we have that and still have the kind of like beneficial technological development that we want in the world? Should we be aiming to do that? And can we do that without risk? So there's just sort of like, what could the world look like? And also concretely, like, what things should we be doing today to get there? What things do you think need to be happening?
Should I be quiet again, Tom, or shall I go first? So magnanimous. How could the world look like? A myriad of different forms. Getting there is the problem, and that's down to processes. And if I were to choose one particular leverage point that would hopefully undermine constellations of actors and power that create existential risk and usually convince us that this is inevitable, it would be deliberative democracy. I think the way the power is set up is largely reflective of our political processes. And most of the experience we have when it comes to deliberative democracy suggests that people are really incredibly precautious and risk averse, and they tend to actually produce policy suggestions and outcomes that tend to reflect pretty well both public opinion as well as what scientists usually think would be the best course of action. And so typically when it comes to climate change, I think in general, the public gets a pretty bad rap. That we kind of often get stuck with this kind of, what I call Schrodinger's public image, which is on the one hand, they're way too cautious and they don't like nukes and they don't like GMOs. On the other hand, they're nowhere near cautious enough, and apparently the creation of existential risk is due to them not thinking existential risk is a problem. But again, when we have deliberative democracy experiments and all the literature we have in it, it's pretty clear the public actually behaves pretty well when it comes to political decision making. And I think if you were to put this in place, it just becomes, to me, largely unimaginable that you have a situation in which there's trillions of dollars being spent on upgrading the US military nuclear arsenal. And it also becomes pretty clear that you wouldn't have the current makeup of policies on climate change and levels of inaction if you actually had citizens in charge, rather than the kind of more oligarchic setup we have right now. So to me, instituting much more clear democratic structures is probably the biggest and first and most fundamental step we can take towards undermining the agents of doom and stopping existential risk. In terms of this other question of how do we do this while ensuring beneficial technologies aren't built, I think we probably put way too much emphasis upon future technologies and the great benefits they can bring us. And first of all, these are usually highly speculative, and it's unclear if they're actually going to be met. And secondly, I think often the biggest bang for a buck comes from very simple measures. I mean, if you're actually going to improve the world in the best way possible, the best thing to do right now would just be plumbing for everyone, access to potable water. You don't need to have AI, you don't need to have synthetic biology in order to do that. These things can, of course, bring some benefits, but there's no reason to think that the best worlds out there rely upon godlike technology.
Yeah, no, I am inclined to agree with you there. I do sometimes feel frustrated about the number of times I hear people talking about the enormous benefits of AI, and without giving any specific details about what those benefits are, it feels like it can be passed over. And it also feels like if you wanted to just apply AI directly to solving like the biggest problems in the world today, that would look pretty different and would maybe not need AI at all, as you say. I wonder if it's worth just briefly, I want to get on to Tom, but you mentioned deliberative democracy, and I think it's probably intuitively clear to most people what that means, but it might be helpful to just say a bit more concretely, like how you envision that, what you envision that actually being, because that might not be so clear to most people.
Yeah, very good point, very good point. So deliberative democracy is usually a system of governance in which you have political processing occurring through either assemblies or juries of citizens who are selected by sortition. And indeed, there's actually some historians and political scientists who look at governance and basically suggest that elections are largely a form of either aristocracy or oligarchy, while democracy historically is usually more through a selection by lottery or sortition. That's the crux of it, basically, is a random selection of average citizens and getting them to make particular either decisions on particular policies, or having them in place in power for a very short period of time. And we've had a number of experiments ranging from same-sex marriage in Ireland, through to, of course, actually kind of historical experiments in places like Tlaxcala and Athene in Greece. Why it works is unclear, but there's a very good case made by Helen Landemore in her book on democratic reason, which essentially puts forward a really good both philosophical as well as empirical case as to why deliberative democracy tends to produce the best results in the long run in comparison to all other government systems. One other thing I should add apart from deliberative democracy, I think the other big thing to do here is just simply to level power. If you don't have billionaires in the world and you don't have individual industries that have a large amount of secrecy and a huge amount of, huge budget, it becomes much more difficult for them to reduce existential risks. And apart from that, I think the other key thing is, if I'm correct that it's largely about power and secrecy, then undermining secrecy becomes potentially a very powerful way of preventing existential risk. And probably the best place to start would be things like commercial non-disclosure agreements and, of course, confidentiality measures when it comes to military-industrial complex. So those are probably the big three I'd think of: is leveraging economic power, undermining secrecy, and deliberative democracy.
Tom, what do you think? What should we do?
I think I've probably got like a sliding scale or escalating list of kind of proposals of what we should do. I think as has hopefully been apparent through this discussion so far, there are some real cross-cutting themes whereby all these potential hazards are very similar. I think they're also quite different in some ways. So if I think, for example, they're quite different in some ways. And we have to start from what you could categorize as, I mean, this is a clumsy using of it, but like a critical realist starting point, as accepting where we are, but not accepting that as absolutely natural and unavoidable. Now, it's important to start where we are, because there's very little use, as I'm quite frequently reminded by colleagues at CSER, and just saying, let's just start again, burn it all down, let's have something new that's perfect. Right? That's not a useful starting point for most of the work that most of us are doing most of the time. So if I think of work that people are trying to do in order to make biological research safer, for shorthand, it's necessary at a really pragmatic level for people who care and have put the time and effort into understanding the political, the way that scientific research can reproduce political norms, can reinscribe existing hierarchies, and can produce or prevent harm down the line, to be involved in that work and to attempt to keep making those differences. I think getting a stage more ambitious from that, it's really important for people who are going to be doing this work, whether it be bio or AI or something else, to actually not have a 1-week ethics course strapped onto the end of their masters, to actually have this baked in from the start as something that is fundamental for the identification of the questions you're trying to research, to who and why is funding your work, and to what the purpose of your work might be, either in a really direct, this is what it's for, or maybe more like think a little bit more boldly about that way. So I guess that's like a really pragmatic, but I guess a lot of the people in this audience who are doing this sort of this work, that might be, I don't know, useful. I think at the same time, there's a space for other things here as well. And I think there is a space which we're sometimes too derisive of in this field for transformational demands and utopian demands. They fit within a much broader ecosystem of the kinds of work we can do. And it's very hard to propose any kind of change from what we have unless there's a proposition for something quite different that is quite attractive. And I think we need to be not just embracing of those, but a little bit bold in even putting them forwards ourselves. There's no reason it should be a more serious demand for Nick Bostrom to say we might all be transhumans and reach our full potential than for someone to say, how about if we shared our resources a little bit more fairly? And I think within this field, maybe we treat one of those as more serious than the other, and it might not be the right way around. But that's my personal kind of view. I think following on from that, and touching maybe on your question of whether I feel optimistic or not, I think I have very little choice than to feel optimistic. We have to try to feel optimistic, you know. So this idea is we have to hope, and it's not just a sense things will turn out okay. It's a hope that is directly attached to struggle and the struggle to make things better. If you do that practice, you get to have the hope. And what I mean by that is we can keep working away on these pragmatic bits of making things safer by increments. But I think it's also important for me to think it's quite hard to imagine a future that is survivable for most, if not all, humanity, that is predicated on a present that demonstrably in some instances doesn't seem to care a great deal about most of humanity. Or certainly at least the people who have a lot of power to do something about that, not demonstrating, whether they feel it inside or not is a very separate conversation. But when the material practices of how we exist don't demonstrate a great deal of care for humanity, it's hard to see a future that would have the same. And I think the fight for that is something we could do. We could certainly stand to bring in more to a lot of our thinking in this field.
Great, thanks. I think I'm going to try and move on to some of the Q&A. There's a lot in here that I've been trying to glance through. I'm going to try and pull out the ones that are a bit higher level rather than some of the very specific ones, but we will look over we'll have the questions recorded, and we're going to do some kind of write-up afterwards. So we'll try and respond to the key themes. So Nathaniel asks, we've sort of covered this, but maybe covering it explicitly would be good. So, you know, are there any specific actors or institutions that haven't been identified as major X-risk sources by the field? Do you see that as a gap in the field? We've touched on this a little bit, but do you think there are things that aren't being recognized enough, maybe beyond what you've sort of already said broadly?
My internet cut out partway through your question, Jess, so I just got the end of it. Sorry.
So it was, is there a gap? And it was this question from Nathaniel Cook saying, is there a gap in the field in sort of identifying actors or sources of risk? And I guess I would build on that and sort of say, how do we build on that? How do we fill that gap? What do we think that the field of existential risk should be doing, if not sort of everyone?
I think, yeah, the short answer is yes. You know, that you could perceive of it as a gap for an research project or a series of them. You could also perceive of it as something that, you know, as a young field that is learning and building still, people can try if they wish to incorporate into their work more broadly. I think there's a couple of versions of this, and, you know, conscious of time, I just nod towards them. One of them is parts of the discipline that could pay more attention to these political economy and power questions. And another way that looks is something that is very literally an effort to map out or list at its most basic source where these hazards live. And I think the kind of evidence or empirical benefit of that would be, you would kind of get to test this case that I think accidentally the three of us have maybe made together, whether we meant to make the same argument or not, that risk lives in a certain place. If you make a map of it, or if you say where it lives, you find out whether you're right or not.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's less of this as a single gap and more it's a series of different gaps. When you look at particular areas such as climate change, we do have a much better understanding and kind of mapping exercise when it comes to both the history, the political economy, and the networks of actors who are responsible. We have things ranging from emergence of doubt by minorities in Conway through to things like Clive Wilkins' idea of the greenhouse gas market in Australia. There's just two examples. There's much wider literature when it comes to thinking about who's responsible for climate change and what's the history of politics in resource allocation when it comes to it. I think there's other areas where it's far more neglected. And I think these tend to be kind of the more emerging technologies areas. And part of this could be methodological, that it's much more difficult when it is an issue which is potentially more dual use, so the benefits to the construction of the technology and the risks are not always, as just mentioned, entirely deliberate. I think it's worthwhile pausing there and actually thinking about what do we mean when we say deliberate and intentional. And it's important to note here that no one, I think, in the series of actors or context we're talking about really wants to destroy the entire world and create extinction. It's more that they produce certain kinds of externalities which could do that, and they don't really care enough to stop it from happening. That being said, it doesn't mean they're not culpable. If someone goes flying down the highway, blindfolded and drunk, we're still going to charge them for manslaughter if they put a few people in the way. And they've still done certain actions fully cognizant of the risks they're creating. And I think it's complicated by the fact that usually these risks are being created for profits and for advantages that are usually accumulated to the few, to the usually powerful. So in short, there are a series of gaps. I'd like to underline Tom's idea of actually trying to have a hopefully more coordinated effort to actually map out both financially, politically, ideologically, and militarily who's responsible. And hopefully that's something that'll be done in the coming years.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd add from my perspective is I certainly agree that even though almost all actors are not deliberately trying to cause human extinction, they are culpable. I still kind of am inclined to, insofar as I think there's a gap here in the field, which I think there is, I guess I'm really interested in, you know, how does this help us to, I always kind of want to bring it back to this conversation, this question of how does this help us to better mitigate? And if we're going to sort of map out all of these actors, let's not have it be a blame game for the sake of it, which I don't think either of you are suggesting. But very much, I mean, I definitely agree that this helps us to understand sort of sources of risk and mitigate them. We've just got a few minutes left. Someone asked about recommended readings, and I thought maybe that would be a nice place to end, is sort of whether both of you have, and I can try and think too, suggestions of things that you would suggest people read in this area. And maybe you could also mention anything that you're kind of working on in your own research that's relevant that people should keep an eye out for.
It's something I've recommended before, but I just went back and read it today. If there are people here who don't have the privilege of being paid to think about existential risk for, I don't know, 35 or 60 hours a week, depending which model of academia you follow, I would really recommend a paper by Simon Beard and Phil Torres, which presents a history of this as a discipline. It's a shortish but academic paper, but it is quite accessible. And I think it really helps locate a lot of the conversations we've had and kind of why there may be a focus in some fields and not on others, in a way that is really useful and not, attempting to kind of destroy things, but is critically engaged throughout. I think that's something really worth reading. And if it's not been linked, I'll link it before we log off.
Yeah, so a few recommendations from me. First will be Annie Jacobson's The Pentagon's Brain, which talks about the history of ARPA and DARPA. And the most illuminating part about it is how frequently you see research from DARPA and ARPA underlining the creation of different key risks. So lethal autonomous weapons, for instance, largely gets traced back to the 1983 Smart Weapons Program. The slogan for that was, "The battlefield is no place for humans." And it seems like that was one of the key catalysts of further research in lethal autonomous weapons. Apart from that, I also recommend Accessories to War by Neil deGrasse Tyson, which looks at how astrophysics in particular has been usually co-opted by the military industrial complex. Last but not least, I'd also recommend Source of Social Power by Michael Mann, which really looked at how power and certain networks of power have shaped global history. In terms of my own work, my book, which will probably be titled Goliath's Curse, due in 2023, will actually be taking a bit of a kind of power-based look at how collapse occurs and potential limits in the future. And I think it's a good note to actually address this question I've got to address before of kind of hope versus, or pessimism versus optimism, which I think is usually a false dichotomy. If I were to play into it, I would usually like Antonio Gramsci's idea of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But beyond that, I think it's really less about having pessimism and optimism. The reason for thinking positively about this is that most of the measures we've spoken about to stop existential risk will also create a better world. A world that's more equal and democratic is not necessarily the worst one. But apart from that, I think it's often less about having hope and more just about doing the right thing and being defiant. When you look at the key events that people usually point to as times when the world was saved, such as Stanislav Petrov and Vasily Arkhipov, it's not that they were being good utilitarians, and it's not that they were hopeful or optimistic, it's that they were defiant and just obeyed orders in order to do the right thing. And I think that's something we need to do both more in the field and hopefully more as citizens when it comes to stopping existential risk.
Yeah, and I think that's a nice note to end on, sort of this idea of we all need to take more responsibility for this or something. I don't know if that's quite what you're saying, but there's almost a theme there, which is right, like we need more people who are willing to be defiant and take responsibility for doing their part to sort of mitigate these risks. Luke, if you might be able to quickly note down the resources you recommended in the chat, because I think some people are struggling to hear. But unless you want to make a final comment, Tom, anything final to say? Happy?
Thank you everyone for, I was watching the participants and it's only dropped by a couple the whole way through. So thank you for everyone who stayed.
Yeah, and I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. I did try and sort of take some of them in the way that I was asking things. But yeah, thank you so much everyone for coming. If you would like to know more about CSER and you don't already, and find out some of our future events, you can sign up to our newsletter on our website, which is CSER.ac.uk. I will also post that in here. Great. Thanks, everyone.